professor in the history department at Lewis and Clark College. Professor Young is the author of Forever Prisoners, How the United States Made the World's Largest Immigrant Detention System with Oxford, Alienation, Chinese Migration in the Americas from the Coolie Era through World War II with UNC, and Caterino Garza, Revolution on the Texas-Mexico Border with Duke, as well as a co-editor of Continental Crossroads, Remapping U.S.-Mexico Borderlands History with Duke as well. He is currently finishing a book titled Excludables about Maya Cuban refugees in the 1980s and the Prison Rebellion in the United States. He is co-founder of the Tepoztlan Institute for Transnational History of the Americas, the Migration Scholar Collaborative, and the Migration Asylum Lab. He has also provided expert witness testimony for over 900 asylum cases. In addition to his scholarship, Professor Young's opinion essays have appeared in the Washington Post, Time, the Houston Chronicle, and the Oregonian. So please let us welcome our speakers. And we can start whichever.
All right. First off, I want to thank everyone who was responsible for putting this together. Ethan, Annalise.
You're going to have to hold the microphone.
Sorry. CJ, everyone else at Malls, and within the Latino Studies History Department, everyone else who's had a hand in this. Thank you. I was ecstatic to be invited. I'm happy to have been here for the last 24 hours. Hearing all of these talks, and I'm now here at the start of the second day trying to figure out what I can say that hasn't already been said 5 or 6 times. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that, but I'll at least say my own experience with this book. And I can say without hesitation, no other single book was more important in helping me to understand how I wanted to engage the history of South Texas than David Montejano's Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas. It was certainly not my first exposure to Texas history. I'm born and raised in San Antonio. I couldn't help but be surrounded by the dead weight of historical tourism that blankets the city and the way that the city often has sort of presented itself to the rest of the world. Like everyone else from this state, I took 7th grade Texas history, and I will say from a particularly awful history teacher, Mr. McCarty at Keystone in San Antonio. I don't know his first name. I would tell you if I did. I know he went on to Antonian after that, so if anyone went to Antonian who's in their 40s now, I'd love to hear more stories about Mr. McCarty. Even as I found myself during high school and into college and graduate school drawn more and more towards history, I was never interested, because of those experiences, in re-engaging with history of my own home region. I moved on to a graduate program in history, wrote an MA thesis about a completely unrelated topic to Texas, but I also knew I had no interest in engaging that in moving towards a dissertation, so I looked around for something else. I knew from a class I'd taken as an undergrad that I was interested in sort of the history of the Mexican Revolution. I had begun to turn, because of some of my professors in graduate school, towards labor history as something I was increasingly interested in, likewise sort of immigration history. And I stumbled upon a few books just sort of randomly that convinced me that maybe it was time for me to look back towards Texas for a possible dissertation topic. Randomly, those 2 books were James Sandos' Rebellion in the Borderlands, which I think has been long since surpassed by a few other sort of important books, though it was one that was eye-opening to me because I'd never heard of these events, right? Grew up in San Antonio, had never heard about any of this stuff. Also, weirdly, the Phil Foner book that mentioned Adolph Douai and sort of socialism in San Antonio that just sort of fascinated me. Again, Phil Foner's a problematic source for a whole bunch of reasons, but it just sort of was like, okay, there's a history here that I maybe, right, my 7th grade history slightly undersold what was happening. That began an incredibly undisciplined dive into whatever I could find that seemed relevant. Right, the older work of Manuel Gamio, Ernesto Galarza, Carrie McWilliams, Americo Paredes, slightly more recent books when I was doing this in the early 2000s, from the 70s and 80s, by scholars such as Arnoldo de Leon, Friedrich Katz, John Mason Hart, Roscoe Martinez, and again, I'm going through a lot of names here quickly, and I'm missing some very prominent names that I should mention, but I apologize to those people. And then more recent works, again at that point from the 90s and early 2000s, by scholars such as Armando Alonso, Neil Foley, Ben Johnson, Elliot Young, Emilio Zamora, among many others. I could write, I feel like I could talk about the importance of a couple of those authors for my own kind of intellectual journey, but we're obviously here to speak about Professor Montejano. No book was as influential in verifying my own interest, in engaging with this history, or in shaping my understanding of the evolution of this region as Anglos and Mexicans in the making of Texas. This was the history I wished I had been taught growing up here, that told a story that reflected my own understanding of the experience of what Texas is, was, and could be. I know I got those a little backwards there. Was, is, and could be probably makes more sense chronologically. It was neither heroic and breathless in storytelling, nor bloodless and passive in explaining how Texas developed as it did and whose work actually built the state. It positioned South Texas not as a peripheral region of the state, but as the place that was most quintessentially Texas. Something that, again, as a San Antonian, made perfect sense to me. As I began my own dissertation research from a school on the East Coast that had no faculty with any expertise on Texas, I found myself continually returning to Montejano's book as a guide for sources and interpretations. It also became a kind of silent advisor and mentor in a situation where, again, none of my professors knew the specifics and peculiarities of South Texas. I really feel like I need to back up here and say I was mentored and advised wonderfully. My advisor, Cindy Hamovich, is an incredibly gifted scholar of migration and labor. She just didn't have any background in Texas. So I kind of dragged her kicking and screaming towards having to deal with Texas in a way that I'm sure she didn't want to. But weirdly, she's now had additional graduate students in the year since who have brought her back there. So I feel like I still need to apologize to her for that. Montejano's periodization called for scholars to pay attention to the shifting economic and social systems they involved in South Texas, rather than a periodization that lazily sought to apply national political shifts to the region. His, as he put it, relaxed class analysis, alert to the shifting lines of race and class that define the social, economic, and political worlds of South Texas as evolved during the 19th and 20th centuries, rang true in my own efforts to understand the region's history. There's room for debate, as I know a number of people have brought up, about whether the book gave sufficient attention to racial violence, both threatened and actual, and explaining the timing and pace of the larger structural changes traced by Montejano. But by pointing out and interrogating structural changes within an evolving class system, he nudged scholars of the region away from an oversimplified picture. Anglos and Mexicans in the making of Texas also, importantly for me, introduced me to Paul Taylor's work, right? Something that's been mentioned by a number of scholars yesterday, an invaluable resource for reconstructing the world of migrant labor in the early 20th century, what I hoped to do with my first book. Taylor's papers and publications not only helped to flesh out some of the particularities of life in South Texas, he also pointed towards the circuits of migration that flowed through South Texas with the studies of communities, obviously in Texas with Dimmitt, Nueces counties, but also in Jalisco, in California, in Colorado, in Chicago, in Pennsylvania, which again, in many ways helped me kind of try and figure out where I saw my own work moving. It's been several years since I finished the dissertation and revised it in my first book, but I still find myself frequently going back to Anglos and Mexicans and the Making of Texas as a sort of reference work. I know Ben Johnson said the same thing yesterday. That's how I've kind of continued to view it. I view it then and now as well as the best general history of South Texas that's been written. Full stop. In my own work, I sought to complement and build on the structural analysis laid out by Montejano by focusing on the ways in which Texas served as a site of migration. How did efforts to enforce both mobility and immobility of workers, as Montejano illustrated in his coverage of things like the Raymondville peonage cases, the immigrant agency law, to take just two examples among many, simultaneously feed and attempt to inhibit the growing migrant stream that spread across the nation? What were the larger national consequences of the developments of South Texas? What had been the effects of this model of development in labor relations? Anglos and Mexicans provided the foundation for the work of certainly me and many other scholars who would seek to place Texas within broader context of national change and the circuits of global migration and capital. Despite, and again, I feel like I'm echoing what almost everyone said yesterday, despite revisiting parts of Montejano's book on almost everything I've written, right? I constantly go back to those chapters on the first few decades of the 20th century. just again as a kind of like, okay, what did Montejano say? That's my kind of point of departure. I hadn't read it cover to cover since working on my dissertation, which is about 20 years ago now. After being invited to speak at the symposium, I went back over it in early January, read it for the first time in several years, cover to cover. Much of it was familiar. Parts of it had become so ingrained in my own understanding that I forgot I had first read it in Montejano's book. But there were a few things that stuck out to me in a way that they didn't when I first discovered the book. And I really want to focus on one of those in particular that I was hoping we wouldn't really get to, or nobody would get to yesterday. And then Professor Montejano himself actually talked about this at the very end. So I'm essentially walking over ground he's already stepped on, which I feel like is essentially the story of my career anyway. The book closes on a note of cautious optimism. Professor Bland referred to this as kind of contingency, and I think in some ways, right, I think both of those work to kind of explain what's sort of happening there as the book is coming to a close. It's published amidst the sesquicentennial of Texas's Declaration of Independence from Mexico. It prompted a year-long celebration of a mythological version of Texas history that appeared everywhere. Right? Those of you old enough remember, right, license plates all over schools, right? The sesquicentennial stuff was just omnipresent. You couldn't avoid seeing it. Montejano's book simultaneously pulled the rug out from under that fabricated version of the past while also pointing toward a very different form of a usable past. He kind of comes to almost the very close of the book by using the infamous drunken dispute that Aaron referenced yesterday between Gus Garcia and Maury Maverick Jr. in the Gunter Hotel, or the Menger, I forget which, one of the downtown San Antonio hotels, right? Infamously, Gus Garcia drunkenly saying, "You damn gringos can have the Alamo, we'll take Kelly Field." And it serves, right, for Montejano in a really kind of fascinating way as a signal in the final pages of the book that things have been changing for years, even if the celebratory narratives of Texas history were incredibly difficult to uproot. And this is, I've asked a couple of people this, and I don't know if it's true, but I'm going to say it anyway. One of the things that I think I remember being true is that T.R. Fehrenbach put out a revised edition of Lone Star in 1986 to try and, I assume, goose up his number of people buying it by putting out the sesquicentennial version. I couldn't find any evidence that existed, so I'm just going to pretend it did. And we can all say, once again, we don't really like T.R. Fehrenbach's book. San Antonio itself often served as the ambivalent stage for ahistorical wish fulfillment that sought to masquerade as history, even if the city and its population presented a vastly different face to anyone who cared to see it. In that sense, again, I kind of look at 86 and 68 as being kind of interesting moments in this sort of evolving historical understanding of what South Texas is, right? The sesquicentennial celebrations rehash the incoherent historical narrative presented at Hemisphere just a few years earlier. That bout of corporate messaging and bland affirmations of multiculturalism in 1968 proclaimed that San Antonio represented the confluence of the peoples and cultures of the Americas on fairgrounds that, of course, had previously housed a primarily Mexican-American working-class neighborhood that was destroyed through federal slum clearance. San Antonio and South Texas were depicted as examples of peaceful coexistence at a time of growing uncertainty, violence, and chaos, right? Famously, Hemisphere opens a couple of days after Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. The real history of San Antonio and South Texas didn't fit this narrative, so they ignored it, leading instead into a fantasy heritage of Spanish conquistadors, leading inevitably, without any messy steps in between somehow, to the elites of 1960s Texas. If the sesquicentennial celebrations still featured a mythological version of the Texas past, they took place, as Montejano points out, within a changed reality in San Antonio and South Texas. As Montejano points out, Henry Cisneros was mayor of San Antonio during the celebrations. Political change was starting to come, even if the meaning of that change was still unclear. Cisneros' rise to power in city government, of course, began within the Anglo-dominated Good Government League, before a well-timed departure from the GGL allowed him to ascend to mayor in the early 1980s as the old North Side machine finally lost its grip on power. If Cisneros' time as mayor served as a symbolic shift in the city's politics, more important was the long, slow work of bringing something that looked like democracy of Texas that was being undertaken by groups, again, that were mentioned yesterday, MALDEF, Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project, right, Citizens Organized COPS, communities organized for, how am I blanking on what COPS stands for?
Public service.
Public service, thank you. I typically don't think of the 1980s as a time period ripe for progressive political change. But I find Montejano's cautious optimism that was what was happening interesting for a few reasons. Right? The structural impediments that had defined Texas economy and society were starting to lift. There were grounds for optimism. Right? As he puts it, the politics of negotiation and compromise have replaced the politics of conflict and control. Right? Willie Velasquez, Henry Cisneros, Citizens Organized for Public Service, there I've got it. To take 3 examples, showed promise that in 1986, the city and its region were moving in a new direction. That argument returned, of course, in Montejano's next book, Quixote Soldiers, in which he showed the Chicano movement had led to a, quote, virtual overhaul of the Mexican-American organizational field and of San Antonio's political system. Those changes emerged from the social ferment for the South and West sides, as he shows. The cautious optimism he expressed in Anglos and Mexicans in 1986 was because of the changes that had slowly emerged out of the movement in the 60s and 70s. Velasquez and COPS in particular carried forward the spirit and tactics of the Chicano movement, while Cisneros certainly had a more tenuous but still important connection to that movement. Skepticism of the depths of this inclusivity is understandable and has certainly been expressed by a number of scholars, but I see it as an interesting through line of scholarship, right? Starting obviously with Anglos and Mexicans, moving into the later books. And I say all of this as we all try to figure out what the hell the role of historian is in this moment. How does our reconstruction of the past speak to our own understanding of the present? Is there a usable past to explain where we are and where we hope to go? If Anglos and Mexicans and the making of Texas is backward-looking, as all history tends to be, it also offers an informed and humanistic prediction of where that past has led us. Right? As he put it, the politics of negotiation and compromise, they've taken a beating over the last few years. Not because that's not where we should be, but because that's not where we've been dragged. And they seem particularly unsuited to our present moment. But history can and should be a progressive discipline. Montejano's Anglos and Mexicans and the Making of Texas stands, I believe, as an example of what that can look like and should look like. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I want to thank the organizers, Annalise, Paul, Ethan, CJ, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here with all of you, and especially to honor David Montejano. I'm going to take a page from Neil Foley's presentation yesterday. This wasn't in my written comments because I was writing about the book, and a lot of which has already been said, so I'm not going to repeat that stuff, but I want to situate myself in this story. And most of the people who presented have presented what they consider their history. They're Tejanos, they're Texans. This is not my history. I'm from New York City. In many ways, I have an inverse trajectory to David, who came from Texas and went up north to Yale. I studied at Princeton along with Raul, who's there in the audience, and then came to Austin. And when I came in 1991 as a graduate student, the only thing I knew about Austin was the film Slacker, which had just come out, and that seemed all right to me. So for me, Texas was really the farthest thing, most exotic thing. I traveled. There's nothing like, you could travel all over the world, to Asia, to different places, but to go to a place in your country that seemed so different than what you're used to was more shocking than going to a place far away. So it really was flying into Austin the first time. I remember looking out the plane window, and I was coming to the city, but all around it, it was just countryside. And if you're in the Northeast, that doesn't exist. It's like from DC all the way up, it's city. And so I was like, what is this place? Where is this city that's surrounded by what to me was the country? I am Jewish on my father's side. My grandfather emigrated as a stowaway from Warsaw in 1913, so came as an illegal to this country. My mother is from India, who emigrated to this country in the early 1960s as an adult. And so I never really felt kind of askew or askance from what this country was, even though, of course, looking at me, people would think, for some reason, I have a claim to this country. And so, as Adolph Reed says, in terms of racial construction, you are what cops see you as. So, cops definitely saw me as white, and I was treated that way. So, but my own identity was different than how a cop might see me. Although the cops in Austin did arrest me on Guadalupe at one point. That's another story. So I came to Austin. I had studied Latin American history at Princeton. I came here because I was interested in studying the relationship between Latin America and the United States. I had spent a year in Nicaragua. This is when the Sandinistas were in power, and the Nicaraguans kept telling us, like, it's great, come down here, learn about our revolution, and then go back, because really our problem is back there, so change your country. And so I wanted to understand, like, what's the relationship between the United States and Latin America, and then I landed in Austin, and I was interested in really Central American migration, but that was a more recent migration, and the obvious thing to study was the border and the U.S.-Mexico border. And I remember trying to come up with a topic, and I was actually in Neil Foley's seminar, research seminar. I think it was my first semester, looking for a topic, and I had read David's book, who has I think it's a paragraph on Catarino Garza. It's not a huge, extensive thing. Then I went to the library, and I was looking in the catalog, and found a reference to an autobiography of Catarino Garza, a manuscript, which is in the Benson. And then I was reading Americo Paredes with his pistol in his hand, and the epigraph is dedicated to his father or grandfather who rode with Catarino Garza. So all of these signals kind of sent me, like, who is this guy, Catarino Garza? But it reminds me that, like what a lot of other people have said, David's book is like a treasure map. Each of those paragraphs you can go off and study and could become its own book. So I think it could provide for a lot of research. So I went on to study Catarino Garza's revolution. And I was fortunate enough to have both David and Neil as advisors, who are kind of the yin and yang of advisors. I'll let you decide who's the yin and who's the yang. But it was really helpful to have both of them on the Chicano U.S. side, and then also have Latin Americanists for the Mexican side of the story, because Catarino Garza's story is a Texas story, but it's also a Mexican story. And I just want to sort of appreciate and thank the people in this room, Neil, David, Emilio, who wasn't here at UT at that time, but who was very generous with his time, Ramon, who I met at a Knox conference in, I think, 1992 in San Antonio, and everyone for accepting someone who was not from here, certainly not Mexican American, and helping me to learn about this history and to write about it. So I won't spend time explaining to you that the book was foundational, indispensable, canonical, whatever adjectives you want to put on it, because everyone else has done that, and it's true. Instead, what I want to do is suggest some lines of investigation, since the book has been written, that might be helpful to think about. And I'm reminded of Ethan's question, a repeated question from yesterday, about the next chapter, the next section in David's book, the next 4
Can I answer it before I can even ask?
Exactly. Yeah, I'm preemptively preventing your question. So I read in the newspaper yesterday that not two, but 3 U.S. citizens have been killed by ICE, and the third one was in San Antonio. And that person, I think it has a Latino name, I think it's of Mexican origin. But what's interesting and connects to the story of David's book is that that person who was killed by ICE, the murder is being investigated by who? The Texas Rangers. And so we're back to we're back to the story, so that could be the anecdote for the next section of David's book. So now on to the lines of where we can go from here for Anglos and Mexicans. I'm reminded of what Jose Marti said, criticar es amar. So I hope David takes these comments in that sense. What is missing from Anglos and Mexicans, and how has the historiography developed since 1987? First, Montejano's book added Mexicans to a story long told as a heroic myth of Anglos coming to a region as pioneers. Other groups, like indigenous people, black people, Chinese, or even the non-Anglo whites, like Italians or French, are not as much highlighted in Montejano's book. Focusing on Mexicans being the biggest of the non-Anglo groups makes sense, but studies of African Americans, Chinese, and others in Texas shows how these numerically smaller groups had an outsized impact on how Mexican Americans constructed their own ethnic identities. As I have shown, and others, even in the border communities along the Rio Grande in South Texas, where Mexicans and Texas Mexicans were the vast majority of the population, racist ideas about indigenous and black people served as a common enemy against whom Mexicans and Anglos united. Harmonizing the interests of the Anglo and Mexican elite was represented symbolically in the Washington birthday celebration in Laredo in opposition to indigenous and black people. But there were also violent attacks against African American soldiers posted on the border in the early 20th century. So this is not just symbolic stuff I'm talking about. These are actual sort of acts of violence that happened both by Anglos and by Texas Mexicans. And what is the history of indigenous peoples in this part of the world? And one of the things I've noticed over the last day is that, aside from, I think Neil mentioned it, and a graduate student yesterday also raised that question, it has been kind of absent from our conversation. And I think from immigration history in general, indigenous people tend to be completely written out. So how can a real reckoning with that indigenous past and present change the narrative of Anglo pioneers settling a wild and rugged hinterland into a garden of prosperity, or the story of Mexicans fighting against Anglo dispossession? In the end, the Anglos and Mexicans in Montejano's book are all colonizing settlers who dispossessed the prior inhabitants of the region. Raul Ramos and Brian Belay and others have begun to write indigenous people into this complex history of negotiation and conflict with the Spanish, the Mexicans, and the newcomer Anglo-Americans. What would the history of Texas look like from the perspective of the Caddo, the Comanche, the Apache, and many more? And this is not something I do, so, mea culpa, I'm part of the problem, but I just lay this out there as I think a hole in the field. The categories of Anglos and Mexicans do a lot of work in this book. Montejano is keenly interested in class in his study of the Botas and Huaraches political parties of South Texas, his study of the Botas and Huaraches political parties in South Texas demonstrates. What's less well developed in the book is a study of the ethnic identities of the Mexicans, some of whom thought of themselves as white, others as mestizo, and maybe still others as indigenous. The white identity of some of the Texas Mexican elite was not simply an effort to assimilate into U.S. society, but was an identity that had been developed by the Spanish in Nueva España, long before Moses Austin and his progeny arrived. White supremacy united the elites as much as it divided them. If the Mexican category needs deconstructing, so too does the Anglo category. Where do Italian and French immigrants fit in, who are an important part of the elite in South Texas? Henrietta King, widow of Richard King and matriarch of the King Ranch Empire, was connected by through ancestry to French and French Creoles in the Gulf. The Italian Bruni family in Laredo occupied positions of power both in politics and in the economy. And people like Captain John Burke, the army captain who led the effort to suppress the Garza Revolution, was Irish, not Anglo. None of these people can be lumped in with the Anglos in any meaningful way. However, they were all white, but so too were many of the Texas Mexican elites. Since the mid-1980s, the field of ethnic studies has helped us to tease out the differences and understand how these categories emerged at particular times and places for particular purposes. It's not that Anglos and Mexicans are not pertinent categories for understanding the history of Texas, but I think it raises a question of who gets erased by framing the study in that way, who's left out of the story. Mm-hmm. Montejano's book is about Texas writ large. It's Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas. But the book really focuses on South Texas, which was central to the conflict during the 1846 Mexican-American War and also key to understanding how Mexican political and economic power was undone. However, a different geographic focus on Central and East Texas would have required a more in-depth analysis of how slavery and the sharecropping that came in its aftermath reshaped agricultural production. Of course, we have Neil Foley's book, White Scourge, which showed how white, black, and Mexican people developed their identities in relation to one another and often on the backs of one another. The push to broaden the framework of Mexicans and Anglos to others is not just an effort of inclusion of different voices in the same story, but a recognition that these other groups were central to the formation of Anglo and Mexican identities in Texas. Even in the places where black people were a very tiny minority, such as the lower Rio Grande Valley, the specter of black people loomed large in the imaginary of Anglo and Mexican elites. What was the role of anti-blackness and anti-Indian sentiments to the claims made by both Anglos and Mexicans over the land? How does the story of Texas look different from West Texas, where the proportion of Mexicans was tiny, or East Texas, where black people were roughly equal to the numbers of white people? How does the story of Texas look different from the perspective of women or sexual minorities? And then moving on to the transnational frame, how does the story of capitalist development that Montejano describes so well in Texas change if we expand the frame to include northern Mexico? The primary analytical frame of Montejano's book traces the political and economic transformations when Anglos overtook Mexicans. But the same kind of economic transformations were taking place across the border in northern Mexico at the same time. The Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz liberalized the economy, invited foreign investment, opened natural resources for exploitation, and pushed industrialization in agriculture, textiles, and mining. Anglo-Americans were also present on the Mexican side of the border as foreign investors, but the story in Mexico was also about the rise of new classes who unseated the old order. In many cases, the new leaders to emerge, think of Madero, Carranza, etc., were the same people who had benefited economically under the old regime. In the lower Rio Grande Valley, some of the Texas Mexican elite also managed to hold on to their wealth and power, even as Anglos bought up land and usurped political power. So the economic transformations in Mexico led to a major social revolution in 1911, while the transformations in Texas led to counter-revolution. We could think about we can think about this exemplified by the violence unleashed against Mexicans in the wake of the Plan de San Diego in 1915. So what were the conditions that allowed for revolution in Mexico, but not in Texas? The ill-fated revolution led by the journalist Caterino Garza in 1891 from the lower Rio Grande Valley through the failed 1915 Plan de San Diego uprising may help us understand why revolutionary movements were quickly suppressed in Texas while they were eventually successful in Mexico in 1910. However, while the Mexican Revolution created the possibility for land reform, which was largely accomplished in the 1930s, no such land distribution happened in Texas. In fact, it was kind of the opposite transformation. Nonetheless, both countries experienced similar kinds of industrialization and mechanized agriculture in the 20th century. Since Anglos and Mexicans, borderland scholars have crossed the border conducting deep research in Mexican archives to understand the place of Texas in a transnational context. And I think David's book, sort of rooted in that, implicitly in that world systems theory, sort of points in that direction that I think other scholars have then gone on to elaborate on. Another point of commonality between northern Mexico and Texas is xenophobia. The United States imposed Chinese exclusion in 1882, while Mexico adopted anti-Chinese migration legislation in the early 20th century. Besides federal legislation to ban Chinese labor, Texans in cities like El Paso and San Antonio participated in economic boycotts and quote-unquote sanitary moral campaigns against Chinese businesses, including restaurants and laundries in the 1910s. Selective policing and ordinances also targeted Chinese shops, creating an unwelcome atmosphere. In Mexico, the single greatest massacre during the Mexican Revolution occurred when more than 300 Chinese people were brutally killed by Madero's Revolutionary Army in Torreon in May 1911. And what's interesting about this, if we think about who were the major capitalists in Mexico that Mexicans might have a beef with, you've got the gringos, the U.S. capitalists, and then you've got the Spanish. You've got a lot of other people, but those people tended to not be targeted at all, and the targeting was to this much smaller group of Chinese who were killed in 1911. And then in the early 1930s, all Chinese were ordered expelled from the northern Mexican state of Sonora. We know much more about the experience of Chinese in northern Mexico than in Texas, thanks to several books being published in the last decade on the subject. And it seems that there were intermarriages between Chinese men and Mexican women on both sides of the border, but we don't yet have a good understanding of the relationship between Anglo-Mexicans and Chinese in Texas. So I think that that's a sort of further line of investigation that could be explored. Montejano's narrative is primarily one of loss for Mexicans in the 19th and early 20th centuries, with some hope for integration and accommodation in the late 20th century. That sort of last section of the book. However, it would be interesting to do a longitudinal study of the Texas Mexican elite over the course of the 20th century. How many of the old-timer Mexican elite families were able to transition to the new economy, hold on to their land, and prosper? One prominent example we could look to who managed to successfully move from the old elite into the new elite was our friend Jose T. Canales. Most people probably know of Canales as his work as the leader of the investigations into Texas Ranger violence in 1919. But Canales, as we also know, helped organize a posse against the Plan de San Diego rebels in 1915, later helped to prevent Mexican immigrant workers from fleeing to Mexico during World War I, and was central to the effort to exclude Mexican citizens from the Latin American Citizens League, the precursor to LULAC. His family's wealth had been based on cattle, but by the 1930s they'd expanded to agriculture, cotton, and oil. What allowed people like Canales to make the transition to the new economy while so many other Mexicans were dispossessed, and clearly the vast majority were dispossessed of their land, wealth, and political power? Was it his willingness, Canales' willingness to suppress the Plan de San Diego uprising, his collaboration with the U.S. government during World War I, or his emphasis on assimilationist politics in LULAC that allowed him to maintain his family's wealth? Texas looms large in the history of the United States, but his specter is even larger for Texans. And so here I want to raise a heretical question as an outsider of whether the frame of Texas history is itself a reaffirmation of the mythology of Texas as an exceptional experiment from its time as an independent nation in 1836 to today. In 2022, your dear Governor Greg Abbott said on X, quote, "The spirit of Texas, rooted in rugged individualism, freedom, and personal responsibility, makes the Lone Star State exceptional in every way. This is why Texas continues to be the top destination in America for opportunity, freedom, and innovation." Clearly, that's not the view of David. It's not the view of anyone in this room. But yet, the frame of Texas as a category of analysis, or I raise this as a question, does it unconsciously reanimate the mythology of Texas as a thing, perhaps a thing worth studying? As my friend and comrade Ben Johnson recently wrote in his epic history of the state, quote, "Texas has a distinct history, to be sure. That is not the same as the rest of U.S. history, but it is also not exceptional." And so yesterday we kind of talked about this question of Texas exceptionalism. And I just raised the question, at what point does the glorification or debasement of Texas mythology become two sides of the same coin? A project, unwitting perhaps, of identity and proto-nation building. So what are the alternatives to this? One could imagine studying regions within Texas where South Texas and Northeastern Mexico form a coherent unit, where West Texas, New Mexico, and Chihuahua form another unit, and East Texas and Louisiana form a third. The point is not that Texas doesn't exist as a political unit or a state of mind, because clearly it does. But perhaps it's time to provincialize Texas, to borrow a phrase from Dipesh Chakravarti. Rather than seeking to show what is unique about Texas, historians could focus on commonalities and economic ties to other countries and other states in the American Union and beyond. David Montejano's newest project, which he told us about yesterday, promises just this kind of provincialization of Texas by showing how Confederate cotton flowed through South Texas to Mexico, finally to England, where it was made into Union soldiers' uniforms and sold back to the North. So it's kind of globalizing in a more explicit way, perhaps, than Anglos and Mexicans, the role of Texas in the world economy. So in closing, I just want to tip my hat to the book Anglos and Mexicans and to its author, David Montejano, without whom many of us, and definitely myself, would not have been able to write the articles and books and the studies that I've done to this thus far. And it is a sign of the book's depth that 40 years later, it still serves as a foundation and a jumping off point for so many studies of Texas. And I hope that on the 50th anniversary, we can come together again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And we only have one mic, so if you're in the back, it is right.
I'm glad you opened it up in terms of these other areas that are complementary and part of the family of works that already exist. They're part of this context within which Anglos and Mexicans appears. There is also an international working class movement that is very important, that is in conversation with the ethnic politics that is going on, largely representing the varied voices in the Mexican community that is international and national at the same time. So the question of whether Texas is exceptional or not, I think the question is what leads people to believe that Texas is exceptional. And it's exceptional in that it's a singular terrain, like no other political terrain, where ideas of class and race are being played out at the public square. And you know that, of course, you've written on that. But I think, I think my book, for example, and the books by San Miguel are in conversation with regards to those two movements that are really extraordinary. And I think it's not that Montejano doesn't address that. He does what he set out to do. And there are instances where he points to these kinds of things. I was really drawn, among other things, to the last major observation he makes regarding the stratification of the Mexican society and the political voices that emerge from that. What is really one of the fascinating questions is how is it that upwardly mobile Mexicans who now become very prominent politically beginning really in the 20s through Lula, why do they continue to assume leadership positions in the community? And why is it that begins to fall off, even, of course, in the 70s especially, and the 80s? In other words, that political history is also very much a part of this history, and the works on the political history is also part of what supplements or is part of the larger story that Montejano so ably presents to us. But I think the international is important, and it's associated with Mexican immigrants. And the ethnic politics is associated primarily with the upwardly mobile Mexicans, which represents a major division. And of course, the left is defeated by the 30s, and with the help of the ethnic Mexicans to some extent. So anyway, I think that's another area of research and conversation that we need to promote. What the Mexicans say, as the folks down the road said, what do they need? What do they want? That question was being asked back then. But the working class movement is divided not only in terms of the Mexican Americans and the Mexican immigrants, but also the white so-called radicals, and beginning with the Socialist Party and then the Communist Party. But anyway, this is an observation. Thank you.
You may want to comment.
I mean, yes, I completely agree, and I think that it's precisely that kind of study of trying to understand the links between organizations like the Mutualistas and then on to the unions and on to the Malonistas, that these are cross-border movements. And so you can't really understand what's going on in Texas without understanding those connections. And I think that's precisely the way to, or one of the ways to engage in this kind of transnational work. And I think, like you're pointing out, you've done it, other people have done it, but we could push that further. I guess the only point I would make about that is that prior to the 1990s, I think history tended to be pretty either focused on the nation, or when it was international, it tended to be comparative, which in some senses reifies the nation as a unit, and so pushing towards more of a transnational perspective precisely at the level of working class organizations across those boundaries is the way to go. So thank you for your work.